Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Five Journeys podcast, Live Like You Matter. I'm Dr. Wendy Trudeau. This is Dr. Ed Levitan, and our guest today is Misha Kogan, Dr. Misha Kogan. He is the medical director of the George Washington University Center for Integrative Medicine. He's also an associate professor of medicine at George Washington University School of Medicine. Dr. Kogan has recommended medical marijuana to thousands of patients and is a frequent lecturer on medical cannabis to professional audiences across the nation. Welcome. We're so psyched to have you here.
Thank you. It's so wonderful being here.
You also just published a book that I left on my kitchen counter, and I apologize. So I can't hold it up and wave it around. But you just published a book.
Maybe I have one. Maybe I have someone.
Wave it around. Is it on Amazon? Because I know people are going to want to read it.
It's on Amazon. Sure.
All right. So we got to start with the basics. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when it wasn't legal. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I want to first actually kind of. You and I had a conversation before, and we definitely have a lot of connections. The one thing I'll say is we're going to talk mostly about cannabis and cannabinoids, and you are a fully trained and working functional medicine physician and have a practice and does a full spectrum of functional medicine. I just want to kind of put that in context for our listeners, because this is
the real deal.
It's not, yes, we're going to be talking about cannabis, but you come from a huge wealth of knowledge, not just cannabis. So then let's talk about cannabis.
Yeah.
So let's talk, what's simple? What is medical cannabis? What's the difference? And what's the difference between that and recreational cannabis, I guess, maybe?
Well, if you figure that question out, you'll probably be a lot richer than you think. There's no real true separation. I think the separation is legal, separation is ethical, separation is intent. So the intent to use is probably what separates how you're using it, and what you're using it for. This whole idea that somehow higher concentrations or more CBD and that, the higher dose per bottle, per vial somehow means more medical. A couple of months ago, I was at New Jersey. New Jersey had a hearing when they were approving recreational cannabis. And so I was asked to speak to the governor there. And it was pretty hilarious because they were completely clueless about some really basic stuff like, if you take 10 5-milligram gummies, guess what? That's 50. And so that you could be quite overdosed with 50. And so the recreational versus medical is really the intent. I think there's a whole idea that more and more states approving recreational we all know why. It has nothing to do with, it's all about the money, right? Because the taxation in some states is up to 30% and more. So if you collect 30%, if you collect 30 cents on a dollar for each dollar generated, you can imagine Colorado is busking in cash from the cannabis industry, and everybody wants to follow the suit. So that's really the reason.
I don't think we should only be cynical, though, because there is definitely benefit to bringing it out from the sub rosa and putting it in,
Absolutely.
Being monitored. Now, okay, it's organically grown. They're not getting pesticides and chemicals. It's not laced with fentanyl. It's safe.
And guess what? And you don't drink alcohol. And your mortality in a state goes down by 10% from car accidents. Mortality from opiate overdose going down by 30 to 40%. Mortality from alcohol goes down by another. Don't quote me on that one. Don't remember. So there's clearly an exit strategy. The cannabis is probably the best exit drug we have in our society at the moment. I don't know if the psilocybin and ketamine and other things will be next, but on a grand scheme, those are tiny fractions compared to how many people use cannabis in the country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. So, I, for a brief stint of time, worked as what we call pot docs and certified people for marijuana. And the most fascinating part to me was the impact of medical marijuana on cancer treatment. Mm-hmm. Do you have any experience in that? Can we talk about that?
We can talk about it as far as you want to go. We can talk about actual symptoms, which of course that's where the evidence is. And then we can be very provocative and say that the most crazy cases of cures I've ever seen, every single one had cannabis, including cases of stage 4, and then now there is no cancer 3 months later.
Well, why is that? I mean, it definitely has anti-cancer properties, but what's that about?
So that's another, if you figure that one out, you'll be probably as rich. You'll be as rich as Musk. So we don't really know. We know that in petri dishes, cannabis is quite effective for most cancers. It induces apoptosis, so literally it kills the cancer cells. What happens in the human body is a very different story. In animal models, it can also be quite effective. So the only thing we know in humans is there is a strong signal, I would say, for brain tumors. So anybody who has a brain cancer probably should be on some kind of cannabis, unless they're taking biologic immune modulators. And then things get much more complicated because cannabis is a potent anti-inflammatory drug. And so if you're giving somebody pro-inflammatory treatment, you don't want anti-inflammatory treatment there. There's some early studies from Israel particularly suggesting harm. So it's not if you read cannabis for cancer on internet, you get like thousands hits, and a lot of the hits are like, oh, I cured my cancer and so can you, or you get this Cheech Chong up in smoke saying that I cured 2 different cancers in the same body. So a lot of this is just a kind of a hype and probably a commercial gain only without real evidence. But the cases are there, the signals are there. I think what's really fascinating is that, put those things aside, for cancer in terms of palliation, and I have 4 boards, right? So I have an internal medicine, integrative, palliative, and geriatrics. And so in palliative medicine, we don't have any better tool. And the funny part, I just took my palliative research 10 years later, and there was no single question on the entire board on cannabis. That does tell you the scope of affairs. We have a whole industry here that treats a lot of different cancer symptoms with cannabis highly effectively. And then we have a standard of care, and they're completely clueless. And they actually advising patients not to do it, not because then if something works, then they can't give them something else. And suddenly they find themselves unable to effectively manage the patient because the tool's not applicable.
So talk to me about how you recommend people getting the medical marijuana, because I always say to people, don't smoke it because then you're going to increase your risk of lung cancer. I usually recommend a tincture or a gummy, my favorite would be a coconut.
Actually, believe it or not, there's zero evidence that increases lung cancer. And there's suggestion that it decreases lung cancer.
That the smoking a joint,
correct.
not vaping, but smoking.
Smoking a joint, you can look it up. Dr. Tashkin has been multiple huge randomized controlled trials, zero evidence of harm. So it causes bronchitis, it causes chronic cough, and I would never give smoking to geriatric patient because you don't want to increase load of toxins on the body, right? I mean, but in terms of cancer, that's another idea, right? I mean, you're putting a smoking, you would expect cancer, but no, you don't. And so, there's a lot of fascinating thoughts and principles and biochemistry and molecular biology that speaks maybe this is real, maybe a future of cannabis as anti-cancer drug. And I will tell you, it will not be in the pharmacological preparations. It will be in the full extracts, because at least for now, everything we see is all about full extracts. But your point is really good. I think the whole point is, how do we deliver it, right? And what do we deliver it for, right? So if I want to give somebody a treatment for nausea and they need an immediate relief, right? I'm actually often will give them some inhaled form, because especially if we're in palliative mode, I'm not worried about worsening bronchitis in 10 years. I'm just making them comfortable today.
What about vaping versus smoking in terms of lung symptoms and reactions?
Well, I mean, it also depends what you're vaping, right? So you have a dry flower vaping, things like Volcano, for example, which is or even simpler devices, but the ones where you just take a dry flower and you vape that. And that actually is probably way, way better than smoking, because you get a lot lower temperature, you get a lot less actual particles going in, versus vaping the cartridges. So the vaping of the cartridges has its own issue, because you get processing chemicals that are up in there. And you've all probably, it's actually important to talk a little bit about that. So there was a couple of years ago, right at the onset of COVID, or even before, I think a year before, we had this condition called E-Valley. So it was basically a damage to the lung from bootlegged cartridges, and some of them were tobacco, but some were cannabis. And there was some kind of preservative that killed a bunch of young people, like about 1,000 people died. And that was because it has nothing to do with cannabis, but of course, there was an uproar in the medical cannabis community saying, what the hell are we doing? So, but that's highlighted the point that, anything that's extracted, anything that has chemical processing, when you take that in, you're going to get that. Now we have this whole issue with Delta 8. And I've seen now 3 cases of severe toxicity that looks exactly like SARS, like mold. But yet there was no mold, and they were Delta 8 toxic because they had heavy metals and some other crazy pollutants that you can't even test with the current strategies on the market, like Vibrant or nothing picks up those toxins. But I mean, there's young kids, and I had a 20-year-old with no silver fillings, not eating, vegetarian, coming in with like mercury that I had a call from the lab. It was that high.
So you're saying it's grown? It was grown in some way or processed in some way that there's mercury?
Yeah, it was a Delta 8 product that he was getting somewhere that had contamination. And there's really good literature on this saying that most of the recreational Delta 8 products are heavily contaminated. And some people do vape them.
What's Delta 8? I know, I'm like, what's Delta 8? I've missed something.
So let's actually sort of talk a little bit about this, right? So we have the sort of psychoactive ingredients or psychotoxic ingredients that we call them THC, right? And then THC is a family of THCs, right? So there's Delta 9 is what we traditionally get from plant. Like if you just smoke a joint or you vape or you eat gummy or whatever, you're getting Delta 9. The Delta 8 is it's not true. It's not a precursor. It does occur naturally in plant in a tiny amounts, but it can also be synthesized in a certain way from the plant. So they can be extracted and it could be formulated in there. So supposedly has a similar effect. It's a little gentler effect, a little less effect. And so, but here's the kicker. It's not regulated. So you can buy it. You can go on weeds.com and buy it and get it shipped to your house because it's derived from hemp. So it's not derived from cannabis. And of course, listeners probably, if you don't know, it's important to know there is no hemp. Hemp is our own definition. There's just one plant, Cannabis sativa, nothing else. There's no radialis. This is all baloney. There's just one plant, and there's about, at this point, 20,000 plus variants. They're not strains. They're not, they're variants. Sometimes we call certain things optivars. They're different terms. But it's one plant, very variable. And so hemp is simply a definition of Cannabis sativa having less than 0.3% in the United States. In other countries, like 0.2% of THC. And that's Delta 9 THC. Delta 8 THC can be made from different concentrates. And yes, in the US, it can be sold basically legally because Congress hasn't acted on this. So then we have CBD. So the CBD and THC are thought to be major cannabinoids, which is completely wrong, but that's the way we talk about it. So the CBD or cannabidiol is this kind of a very unique molecule. It doesn't directly affect the receptors, and it doesn't necessarily directly changes our own cannabis production, but it modulates how our own cannabis system, which we'll talk in a second about, works internally. So when you take CBD, you modulate not receptors, just like when you take THC, you attach THC to the receptor, CB1 or CB2, and then you have a whole cascade of effects. But the CBD directly does not do that. So it somehow works with our own endogenous cannabis system to make it more efficient and then cause some other additional benefit through non-CB1, CB2 receptors. There's TRP receptors and a whole bunch of other ones. And so it's a fascinating system that we and all animals have this endogenous cannabinoid system. And then the plants, and cannabis is not the only plant, by the way. The most recent fascinating thing is CBD from citrus. You guys heard that?
No.
Yep. Well, so for the government workers, you can't have hemp, right? Because you're going to have traces of THC. If you get tested, it doesn't matter that you never took THC product. You'll get fired because your urine is positive. There's zero tolerance. But if you get it from citrus, there's nothing. Nobody can do anything to you because you never took hemp from. Well, you never took CBD from hemp. So even if your urine tests positive, you actually can defend that because you say, "Look, I got my CBD from oranges." And actually, you will not test positive. There's zero THC in the settings like this. So there's several companies doing that.
Interesting. How much? That must be really concentrated, right? I'm assuming
it must be, and I would be really worried about that. I would be very worried about when you take a huge amount of plant and then dramatically concentrate, right? Because think of it this way: if you started even with organic material, you may still end up with some traces, tiny traces of contaminants, which you concentrating heavily and then ending up with something in there, which could be a problem. So
yeah,
interesting.
Can we go back to cancer before we leave that completely?
Sure.
What are you so obviously if you're on an immunologic modulating cancer protocol, you would not be a good candidate for THC. But then how about the patient?
I'm not sure. I think it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're on a palliative treatment and even with immunologic treatment, but you really have tons of symptoms and you can't manage them, I'd still easily prescribe because I wouldn't, my intent there is to help the patient in the moment. I'm not trying to say, So that's where we have tremendous amount of evidence. And actually in 2017, National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine put a really profound report. In fact, even now, 5 years later, which in field of cannabis, 5 years, it's like a century in medicine, right? Because it's like things are moving so quickly. But even still, that report I consider the most profound and the largest evidence that we have for the benefit. And they literally said it's grade A treatment for pain, chronic pain of any kind, including fibromyalgia, for nausea and vomiting during cancer, and for spasticity, particularly in multiple sclerosis. So, we have a conclusive evidence. And despite that, most of the societies still don't recommend using cannabis because of the Schedule I controlled substance.
Right.
So
all right. I think you and me have a little bit of different thoughts and agendas.
No.
But
that never happens, right?
Shocking.
That never happens.
Shocking.
Never happens.
Honey, what do you want to talk about today?
Good. That's
we want to make sure we, take care of it.
No, well, the thing so you touched upon this because I have because this is fascinating to me because there's, as you said, there's not only THC and CBD, there's all these other variants of the cannabinoids. And you have 20,000 variants. So, and every dispensary has their own formulas. Or it seems like it, maybe, to the untrained eye, me. So how do you actually go on and prescribe something that's clear for cancer, for anxiety, for depression, for
that's the $1 million question, and we do have a answer to that. I mean, that's why I feel strongly that it's already becoming a cannabinoid medicine or field of cannabinoid medicine, because in reality it's that complicated, and you have unlimited number of variabilities. If you have a good strong dispensary, you could walk in and have a few hundred products, and they're going to be separated by the ratio of CBD to THC. They're going to be separated by the particular product's going to have more calming effects, or more of the terpenes that are more sedating, like maybe a myrcene or linalool, versus something more activating, like a pinene. And so if you're more activating, you're going to use it more for, say, cognition, or for to stimulate cognition, or to uplift someone, versus if you're depressed, you can try to take that for more. So, I mean, the complexity is so high that literally at this point, we have few professional courses out there that people have to take if they want to be serious about it.
Okay, but for the listeners, you're going to kiss a lot of frogs, and you might not find your prince on the very first time.
Hold on.
You have to try a
Let
little.
him finish for a second. Hang on.
There is a kind of an easy way into it, right? So most of the time, there's a big categories, right? So if you talking about someone who comes to you with pain, you know they're going to need some THC most likely, and you're going to you may give them some CBD, but you have some sense that how you're going to do it, right? And then you also have to think about the route of delivery. So how do you actually going to give it? We started talking about, like, let's say you're going to vape, or you're going to take. Most of the time when patient comes in, and I say 90% of chances, I'll start with sublingual oil drops. Sometimes we call it FECO, full extract cannabis oil. So they'll put it right in their mouth most of the time, because I can titrate it precisely. Like usually my starting dose is 1 milligram of THC equivalent, and then you titrate. And they may not even feel anything for 2-3 days, maybe for 5 days, because I want to get in that chase spot. So another huge, so you have all this variance. You have different cannabinoids, you have different terpenes, flavonoids. And then you also have the point of what we call start low, go slow, deliver it where it needs to go and stay there. So you're going to find the spot in J curve, because when you start at a very low dose, you're not going to expect benefit quickly. Then you're going to start titrating, and you get to a point where this is the best spot. If you keep increasing the dose, not only are you going to lose that spot, you're going to start having this problem you're trying to treat. So you take too much, if you're treating nausea, and now you have a hyperemesis syndrome. So too much vomiting and nausea. So you have, you started here for pain, you got here, you keep taking, now you have hyperasthesia. So you have too much pain. So cannabis is actually kind of unique in this. If you take too much of something that's good, you're going to cause the symptoms you're trying to treat. Nobody fully understands why that happens yet. There's seemingly endogenous tone, and the tone does both ways, up and down. And depending on what you're trying to do, you have to get the best possible spot and then stay there, which is also not easy, because, that's the biggest challenge of the industry at the moment is not knowing the ratios or have an organic process. I mean, we all know how to do that. It's really, how do you keep batch to batch predictability, and how do you keep it being a plant extract, how do you keep it pharmaceutical grade? And there are very few companies that like thinking this way, because they're all like, okay, well, it's botanical, so let's just keep doing. Yeah, that's great. But for the patient, they found something that works great. Like, for example, insomnia, it's usually the first symptom I treat when a patient comes in with multiple conditions, because it's 90 to 95% efficacy. I don't have any other tool that's that effective for insomnia. But so let's say I treated their insomnia very well. Now they're great. But guess what? A month later, they run out of that tincture. They go back and, oh no, we don't carry that tincture anymore. Why? Well, because our manufacturer is no longer making it. So try this one. And the whole process has to start over, because the concentration may be different. The terpenes may be different. The ratios may be different. And next thing you know, patient's not very happy because they have to redefine the process. And that keeps repeating. So there is definitely an attempt by several industry partners. Like the one I know is called Canaceutica, which is they making capsules. That's an RSO Rick Simpson oil capsules, but they batch to batch is 100% predictability. So you're not going to get a variant from, if you get that, whatever the product you got on the day one, 3 months later, it'll be exactly the same. Versus when you're buying oils, especially when you're buying flour or when you're buying vapes, there is a change. There's difference from one batch to another. Then the industry is going to solve this, but it's probably going to take a while before we're going to have like a really good, predictable, steady set of products on the market.
So these are all edibles then you're talking about, essentially, if they're pill form? No, I thought it was pill form.
So that's important. So tinctures, we don't consider edibles. Edibles is something you chew and you eat.
Well, I thought you were referring to a pill that they've standardized. That
right.
Cannaceuticals.
Correct. So those would be capsules. So they can put the oil in a capsule and then it becomes an edible, because you don't put it sublingually. When you put it sublingually, we just call it sublingual, because by default, it bypasses the first pass through the liver. So you're not getting, this is also an important concept. You see how many details here? So when you take the THC and you pass it through the stomach, it's going to get 4 to 5 times hyperactivated, because the 11 delta THC, which is metabolite of delta 9, is way more potent than the delta 9. So it's like 4 times more potent. So you can take 5 milligrams gummy versus 5 milligrams sublingual drop and have a pretty different effect. And in fact, a lot of the times that's part of the problem. You have a frail older person going to dispensary and somebody will sell a gummy to that person, and they'll eat the gummy 5 milligrams and they'll be tripping for 24 hours and being lethargic. It happens quite a lot, unfortunately. And if the people don't know that, that's one of the common initiation mistakes.
I mean, when you're thinking about insomnia, you have to take into account how old are you, because especially if you're going to do an edible, which lasts longer, but you're older and you're not metabolizing as well, here you are, it lasts a lot longer. So yeah, I used to start people on tinctures just because you could control it a little bit better. Once it's in your stomach, you got a while.
Well, I mean, my ears perked up when you said insomnia, because I have people that no matter what we do, and I've tried CBD with combination, like we use a product that has CBD in it with GABA, with L-theanine, with passion flower, all sorts of cool combination, and still nothing. So chances are you're actually underdosing them with CBD. In order for CBD to work for insomnia, you sometimes have to cross 100 or even 200 milligrams at bedtime. Oh, wow.
So it's a dose dependent. You can also just simply combine it with CBN. So if you get a ratio of the ratio doesn't matter here. If you get 10 to 20 milligrams of CBN, then you can get away sometimes with like 25 milligrams of CBD. But CBD alone will work. You just have to keep titrating the dose and not being afraid of it. The problem becomes not the practicalities. I mean, 200 milligrams of CBD at bedtime. Exactly. It's not cheap.
That's actually like the whole bottle. So basically down the bottle.
No, I mean, we now use usually 3,000 to 6,000. I mean, nobody's using 1,000 anymore. That's a couple of years back.
So what would you do what is your kind of starting point for insomnia? I see a lot of Lyme patients that even if I give them pharmaceuticals, don't do very well. So, and sleep is so vital. And the nice thing about, well, actually, let me ask you, does cannabis affect sleep architecture in a negative way?
That's a great question. So THC does, not in every person, but it does. So THC does, and especially at the doses that are more than 5 milligrams, it can negatively impact architecture. CBD does not.
Okay.
So that's actually the reason why most of the time you want to at least try it with CBD, but really it's more practical. Patient is since I see patients from all over the world. I mean, if they're in a place where they can get legal THC, then what, right? So how do you do that? Well, then you just go with CBD alone. But other practicality is the cost. I know that they will end up with taking 100 to 200 milligrams, and that's going to cost them way, way, way more than 1 to 5 to even 10 milligrams of THC. So I look at this because it's going to be long term. They're not going to be on it for a couple of months. I mean, there's probably going to be a long term, especially if you're treating chronic Lyme, right? I mean, you're not telling them, oh, you're going to be better in 3 months. I mean, this is going to take a while, a few years, probably at least a year, I would say on average. So you have to get them prepared. But nowadays after I teach them basic sleep hygiene and some mindfulness, I go straight into it because acupuncture is more expensive. Can work, sure. Herbs, more expensive in a way because you get doses titration. So, and, I'm in a tri-state area of Maryland, District of Columbia and Virginia, and every state has medical. So I can get everybody in my own area where they come to see me face to face. I can get them cannabis. But if they're calling from other states, usually we start to find out, is it legal? And then if not, then we'll start with CBD. And CBN always comes up. People always ask me, so should I just take straight up CBN? It does work for some people, but it's just not as interestingly enough predictable. So usually I say, sure, you can do some CBN, but try to take it with some CBD. There seems to be a better efficacy. And then you decide what else they need. If they have a Lyme, right? You want a lot of anti-inflammatory effect, and they probably have some pain. So if they're not sleeping because they're hurting at night, I'd get a lot of CBDA, cannabidiolic acid, because it's it's like Motrin at bedtime. It's actually more effective than Motrin if you titrate the dose up. Problem with CBDA, again, cost. You can get Motrin for a couple of pennies literally per tablet, and CBDA is going to be way more expensive. So you also keep running into these practicalities. If they have a lot of anxiety and they're just like they can't cool their brain down, I keep titrating CBD. That seems to be the best. So you also have to start kind of thinking in parallel what else is happening, and then titrate. If they also have neuropathic pain, they can't get THC. Well, give them CBG. CBG can be very effective for neuropathic pain.
You also avoid it in liver dysfunctional patients. You would avoid THC, right?
Not really. I mean, again, I'd give them sublingual drops, so it doesn't go to the liver. If they're really like cirrhotic, I don't actually think I have patients like this, but I probably wouldn't worry either, because in reality, it's not just it is metabolized through the liver, so you may just get way more bang for your buck, so to speak. But it's not gonna. The way it's broken down is a non-liver related system per se. It's just getting metabolized through the liver.
So it's interesting because when you talk about Advil is very cheap up front, but it creates a tremendous toll on the back end in terms of you have to detox it. You're stressing the liver. If you're not stressing the liver here, and the liver can be free to do detox, which is what we're all about.
Always go back to principles of holism, right? If the body designed in a certain way, it's not random. And so the beauty of cannabinoid, exogenous cannabinoid system, we mimicking endogenous. So
we didn't talk about this, actually. We haven't talked about our endogenous cannabinoid system.
Right,
Can you talk about that?
I kind of started mentioning, but I didn't go into any detail. So we make our own cannabis every day of our life from the moment we were born. And actually, we make the most somewhere between ages of 12 to 17, and then game's over, kind of like that. No, it's not. It's just the decline is very slow. But we are losing about half of our endogenous tone, so the amount of cannabinoids produced somewhere around the age of 50 to 60. So, and it's not an interesting. So some systems in our body continue to make the stuff, right? Cannabinoids its own demand. So when you have a stress, when you have pain, when you have some kind of trauma, then there's this massive upregulation of the cannabinoid system. Or when you exercise. Remember, we always thought that runner's high is the endorphins. That was debunked. It's all cannabis. So our body makes enough cannabis during exercise, it gets upregulated so that you feel good. And it works similar to a lot of other pathways in the body. Like we always think about neurotransmitters, right? Like Ed, you mentioned GABA and L-theanine you're putting. So that's like what we call an inhibitory. So cannabis in some way is an inhibitor of a neuroexcitation. So when you have something that upregulates us rapidly, like the stress, trauma, etc., cannabis's first and most important part in the system is to downregulate that very quickly, because other systems then kick in after as a response. And then that's why it's so effective for pain. It basically blocks the sudden not sensation, but the perception of pain. It also blocks peripherally sensation of pain, but not as potent as the perception of pain. That's actually why it's a unique and really potent analgesic, because there is no other drug in our armamentarium for pain that could affect perception of pain. Opioids don't do that. I mean, everything works usually on the level of actual receptors and or centrally, but not on the level of how do you interact with your own pain? How do you live with the pain, right? And cannabinoids generally help patients tremendously to simply live better quality of life despite having some kind of organ dysfunction that causes pain. So, and that we do that regardless whether we put something from outside or not. We do that because we have that system in us. And there are different molecules. I mean, there's actually a lot of them. We know two the big ones, anandamide and 2-AG, but there are a dozen others, less known, less understood, but not less important necessarily.
Yeah. So I'm sitting here like thinking, first of all, I've already learned a lot that I'm going to put into practice, which doesn't happen very often. So thank you.
Pleasure.
And that I'm trying to get a sense of, well, okay, so going back to sleep, I have, what do I tell my patient to go look for dispensary? Or what does the patient, what are they looking for? What's the actual prescription, which is not a prescription, obviously.
Well, you need to educate them more. One thing you can simply tell them, get Dr. Kogan's book, open the chapter on sleep, and follow exact cases, because I have cases in each chapter, and follow directions. So you can give them resources, first of all, because you can spend half an hour with the patient telling them precise finding the strain specifically, like you're going to, what we used to call indica, which is like, it's really not, just don't use those words because they don't mean anything. Everything hybrids pretty much. And even like indica can have stimulatory effect on some people, and sativa can have depressing. It's really all about terpenes in the way how that entourage effect or combination of major cannabinoids with other minor cannabinoids causes the effect on the body. But it's a little different on everybody. So there's still experimentation, even in the best case scenario. You're going to tell them, okay, go get your calming strain, couple of milligrams of THC from dispensary. Take it like an hour or 30 minutes before bedtime and titrate it up slowly. But you don't actually know. It may be stimulating even at low doses. So for most people, it's one, but then for some people, it's another. So you have to kind of prepare them that, okay, if that happens, don't panic. It just, we'll keep with the process. At the end of the day, if they stick with the process, the efficacy is so high that everything else we do, I always tell people, well, the GABA, sure, great. L-theanine, sure. But we all know that the level of efficacy is, a 30% get response, we feel great, right? But here, I'd say 80 to 90%, once you get there. It's getting them there requires a lot of information, coaching. And so I actually feel strongly that the future is all about coaches. We, docs, should not be doing this. We're too expensive. We don't have time to call the patient every week and say, hey, what's going on? Where are you? What's your dose? Have you tried this? Okay, why not? Like when you tried that? Oh, that happened. Okay, so now we're going to do this. That's the level of feedback. I'm sure somebody's going to try to automate it. I'm sure there's already works on the apps and things like this where this is going to be built into some kind of a platform where you feed the computer something and it'll, but that's also lacking human aspect and maybe.
See, this is where you kiss a lot of frogs before you meet your prince. I always say that to people, you're going to kiss a lot of frogs, but tell me something.
Exactly right.
Yeah, you kiss a lot of frogs, but I have a question because I always have a question. So, are you recommending that people do tinctures or edible, something they're swallowing versus something that's sublingual? Because the sublingual will last like 4 hours.
Exactly.
So it wears off just when they need to be sleeping.
That's
and
right.
Then, so are you saying do an edible? Because you can't titrate as easily.
So start with sublingual, titrate it to when they're falling asleep well. And then once you know the rough dose, you transition to the edible. If you're a young person and the situation is horrible, like, somebody's like really not sleeping, and you can even sometimes just start straight with edible and just tell them, okay, if you overdose and you're groggy next day, don't be surprised. We'll cut the dose down. Sometimes what I'll tell them, go get 5 milligram gummies, cut them in quarters and start with 1 quarter, or even less. I mean, so that's another option. So you can do the oral, but that depends on what kind of insomnia they have. If they can't fall asleep, tincture is probably going to be more predictable, more, not just more predictable, but more consistent effect. The other problem with edibles, well, it depends on what's in your stomach. If your stomach is relatively full and there's a lot of fat in it, you're going to have one level of absorption or one speed of absorption. If you don't, it'll be a little bit different. If you keep it in the mouth long enough, you're going to have partial sublingual absorption and then partial. So that's another way. You can have them chew it, hold it in the mouth for 5 minutes and then swallow. So they're going to get both So there are all these intricacies, and that's why I think the coaching, like, it's just most people will not learn that unless they're so interested in it. So we have a lot of enthusiasts who coming in and they're like, oh, I want to know everything. They will buy my book, they'll read the whole thing, and then they'll have like 10 gazillion questions because they already like tried stuff on their own. So those are much easier to work with patients. But if you have somebody who's completely clueless, and by the way, their primary care said, oh, cannabis will kill you or something stupid like that, we're still hearing that periodically. Not a lot, thank God, but still happens. And so then they going against the grain there, or like the like 90, like my favorite story. So where I'd have like 95-year-old grandma who has some really advanced Alzheimer's with a lot of psychosis, and nothing works. And of course, cannabis is amazing in the cases like this. And so the kids would bring the mom or parent, and the kids and I'd start at some point, and they're just coming in for geriatric appointment, right, to see me. And so I'd say, well, we're going to start with cannabis. And kids like, what? Isn't that illegal? And the grandkids in the corner, I told you so. I told you so for years, and you didn't listen to me. Now look, so that always gets me. Cracked up.
Misha, I have a question for you. Do you recommend that people try to find their tinctures in oil versus alcohol? Because I know that alcohol can be really difficult to keep in your mouth. Alcohol can be difficult. And the other problem with alcohol, it means that it was extracted a little different. So when when they're doing the original first extraction, it comes up as an oil to begin with. So it's much better. So it's often less processed. But alcohol has some benefits. It has some advantages because it's a bit differently preserved, and it's sometimes better diluted or better distributed through the tincture. So we have a lot of this issue where people will forget to shake the bottle. And like I have this case in the book, which is kind of funny. It's a patient who I knew for a very long time that she went on vacation, didn't take the tincture with her, came back, took her tincture for sleep. And then next thing I know, I get a call from emergency room that they call me and saying, we have a patient who claims that she's dead and she would like to talk to you from that other place being dead. And I'm like, what? Like, what, you guys? And then like everybody's dying laughing there. So, so that can happen. So if you forget to shake the tincture and you get so stoned just because, that's with the oil. With alcohol, that's less likely. But I agree wholeheartedly. But you also brought up a really good point. When you go on vacation, do not cross state lines with your THC, even if it's legal in the 2 states. Do not cross state lines. Do not take it on a plane.
Crossing is illegal.
Crossing is a federal offense. So don't travel with it. And B, if you're going to take a break from it, you've now increased your sensitivity. So you have to decrease your dose by at least 50%,
and
if not more.
Don't forget to shake.
Don't forget to shake, decrease your dose, and don't cross state lines.
Exactly.
All right. So we've talked, I want to kind of like go back to, we've talked geriatric, we talked insomnia.
We talked cancer. What are the other, cancer is like one of these.
Cancer is hard because it's such a big field, and nausea, vomiting in cancer and pain in cancer, I'd say it's so clear and so effective and often just so patients preferred, because like if they take more pills or if they take, especially pain pills, like we know there's so many side effects. It's just, and also like in studies, often euphoria is considered a side effect. When you have a patient with advanced cancer, I'm yet to hear from a single person to say euphoria is a side effect. So it's also depends on the fact that it just actually improves quality of life for people who are suffering a lot with all kinds of chronic conditions.
So what are the other top 3 to 5 things that you want to think of for cannabis? Like, I know anxiety is probably a huge one there.
Anxiety is huge. Anxiety has some evidence for CBD, but the problem with anxiety, it has a lot of different causes, and I wouldn't think of cannabis for anxiety as first line, because I would try to treat the cause of anxiety, right? If it's a more psychologically driven stuff, we'd send them to a psychologist, or if it's more just, they're wrapped up in their mind and they need to drop into the body, we'll send them to mind-body teacher or just MBSR and whatnot. But I'd say for the top 3, well, definitely pain and all kinds of variations of pain. If it's a chronic pain, think cannabis for sure. Sleep, any kind of sleep disturbances, think cannabis. Nausea, vomiting, chronic of any kind, think cannabis. So those are definitely top three. The following really close: spasticity of any kind. It doesn't matter whether it's multiple sclerosis spasticity or anything else, like a post-stroke, for example. People get a lot of they have a contraction on one side and the body is really hard and spastic, so can be very effective. And then I'll tell you something that you probably never heard of, and that is typical dermatologic conditions. So eczemas, any kind of rashes, anything that is localized. I mean, of course, if it's a whole body, you wouldn't put it topically, but the topical cannabis is heavily underutilized, and I don't understand why. I know this is one area where pharma is hugely investing into topical CBD. I mean, there's like a half a dozen of companies running to the top, including Pfizer paid $6 billion for like some startup very recently, because it's a huge market. Like eczemas, psoriasis. I published a case on psoriasis, CBD or THC. It's not exactly clear what ingredient is better, but I've probably cured hundreds, if not thousands, of different eczema and psoriasis cases just with topical. You just put it locally there. If their process is not widespread, if it's widespread, it starts to get complicated. But if it's a minor problem, amazing. And then all things gut, whether it's IBS, whether it's Crohn's disease, whether it's ulcerative colitis. Ulcerative colitis suppositories, I mean, I've had a few dozen of patients, they don't take any drugs. They just take the rectal suppositories and that's it. And that manages their ulcerative
CBD,
colitis.
THC, or a combination?
Combination.
Okay.
Yeah, usually it's either one-to-one CBD to THC, because those are the easiest to find. If they can make their own, I sometimes would put other things like CBDA, CBGA, because that seems like it's also very effective as an anti-inflammatory. So think of anything that is within a reach of delivery system. So if it's an easy delivery system and it's an inflammatory condition, it's totally worth a try.
We should put it in our daughter's ears. Seriously, she always has ear infections.
You could totally try it. You could totally try it. And it wouldn't, I mean, it's because, like how much THC is she going to absorb from the ear?
None.
A tiny amount.
That'll be fun, though.
What?
That'll be fun. Too much.
Yeah. Parenting moment 101. Do not try this at home.
So
my kids use topical CBD. Like I have 13 and 15-year-old. 13-year-old has this condition where the bones grow fast. So he has this aching in the joints. And so he was like going professional skateboarding, but now he can't do it so we start putting him on some CBD topically and he loves it.
And is that a special preparation, or you just do
No, just commercially available.
We have CBD. We have cream CBD, and it's been cool. I use it for pain.
Yeah, exactly. That's what you want. But you want it as concentrated as possible. So you don't want to use like 100 milligram per jar. It's just nothing. Like probably start with 500 and up. So 1,000, 1,200 in a 2 ounces jar, which 2 ounces are usually standard size. So keep going up as much as possible. Sometimes you have to have THC too. So it's not really clear. But once you need to THC, then of course you have to get a card and like it's a lot more complicated.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I always ask people, do you want to be high or you just want to have resolution of your symptoms, right? Because that'll determine whether you have the balance of CBD to THC or if you're just going to go straight THC.
I don't know. I think it's a judging question. I don't know. I
say straight up, if you want to be high, go for more THC. If you're looking not to have your brain impaired in any way or changed, then you're going to want to make sure that you have at least 1-to-1 of CBD to THC or a higher ratio.
Much higher. Yeah, much higher. It probably like 10-to-1 would be where, I mean, you could still get high, but it's going to be different high and it's not going to be very intense. And if you, because, sometimes really the THC is the key. In fact, often THC is the number one key. It's not the CBD. So the data on CBD is almost non-existent. I mean, there's some data on anxiety, but outside of that, and it's a little mind-boggling why that is, because CBD can be obtained from hemp. So in terms of the just sheer research potential, there should be more of it, but it's still the research is in infancy, even though that infancy is rapidly growing, but it's still infancy.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I'm assuming that all of our listeners have 8,000 additional questions and want to follow you. How can people reach you?
gwcim.com. So that's our website, www.gwcim.com. Everything's on the website. I have my own website, but the main one, you can find us there, and all the information is there, as well as like a coaching information for how to get in touch with me and then a coach. And then, of course, you can just get the book. So if it's just Medical Marijuana, Dr. Kogan's Guide to Cannabis and CBD on Amazon, and it's a Random House. It's a big publisher, so it's everywhere. There's also an Audible, and I'm proud of the person who read it. It's the same person who did Life of Pi. So he's got a great voice. And the book is written quite simply. So it's definitely not a medical book. The way it's written, it's like for just an average person to read.
Awesome. This has been fascinating.
Yeah, we can talk for hours.
Yeah, we totally could. So thank you for joining us for another episode of the 5 Journeys podcast, Live Like You Matter. Our guest today is Dr. Misha Kogan, and we talked all about cannabis. You should get the book. Get his book. It's a great book.
Misha,
thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I hope I'll see you guys soon, sometime in Boston. So
definitely.
Yes, absolutely.